Hi, I'm Jay Dingman, the owner and head brewer at Barley Mow Brewing Company in Largo, Florida. In this section, we will be discussing recipe formulation. Recipe formulation is one of the most important aspects of brewing. Second only to good brewing practices, a brewer's ability to create a recipe that is both flavorful and unique is the backbone of a successful brewery. In order for a brewer to not only formulate a recipe, but also brew that recipe with consistency time and again, requires a complete understanding of each ingredient, its purpose in the recipe, and how it might vary from batch to batch. In this section, we will take a closer look at beer recipes and how they are written. Creating a new recipe typically moves through three phases. A. Deciding what to brew. B. Recipe formulation. And C. Testing and pilot brewing. A. Deciding what to brew. For today's brewer, deciding what to brew can be a challenge. With over 90 recognized styles of beer and access to ingredients from all over the world, a brewer is limited only by their own imagination. For the larger macro brewer that may only brew a handful of different styles, there isn't much of a decision to be made. But for the majority of craft and home brewers, their brew schedules are usually a blend of traditional and experimental recipes. Some of the considerations that a brewer might take into consideration when sitting down to write a new recipe are the popularity of a style, that style's marketability, a focus on specific ingredients, the season, upcoming holidays, or focus on a specific region. Regardless of what motivates a brewer to create a new recipe, the near limitless combinations of ingredients and styles that a brewer has to choose from is the driving force behind the boom in the craft brewing industry. Each brewer's unique interpretation of styles is what keeps the industry exciting as more and more breweries and beers continue to enter the market. B. Recipe formulation. Once a brewer has an understanding of what they intend to brew, they must begin the process of putting together the actual recipe. Much like with baking, brewing requires a thorough understanding of what each ingredient and process adds to the recipe. It is not enough to simply know what ingredients will be used, but how much and to what extent they will be used. For example, while salt and sugar are both ingredients in an apple pie, how they are used and in what ratios is critical to the outcome of the recipe. While those ratios do allow some variance, there are limits. One baker may make an award-winning pie using 3 tablespoons of salt and 3 cups of sugar, while another may succeed with a more health-conscious recipe using only 1 tablespoon of salt and 1 cup of sugar. Even though each pie will have different flavor profiles that appeal to different customers for different reasons, both still fall under the category of apple pie. That said, the novice baker that makes his recipe with 3 cups of salt and 3 tablespoons of sugar probably won't end up with a product that falls under the same category and probably won't sell very many pies either. In his book, Designing Great Beers, Ray Daniels writes that good recipe formulation can be broken down into 6 steps. Number 1, identify and characterize the beer you want to make. Number 2, determine malt and extract bill. Number 3, determine water quantity and chemistry. Number 4, determining the hop bill. Number 5, select yeast and fermentation plan. And number 6, ascertain finishing issues, including clarification and carbonation. Number 1, identify and characterize the beer you want to make. Whether it's pies or beers, a good recipe begins with some form of research into what goes into the style that you are trying to create, or in some cases recreate. Each style of beer brings with it a set of characteristics that most drinkers consider defining points of that particular style. These style markers can and usually include color and appearance, aroma, flavor, and alcohol content. While a brewer may push the boundaries of a style in various ways, there is only so far they may go until they fall outside the guidelines for the style they are trying to brew. If a brewer sets out to brew a brown ale, that simple delineation begins to define a drinker's expectations. First, they expect it to be brown in color. Second, they probably expect it to be malty in flavor. And finally, they expect it to be fermented using an ale yeast. Even though the brewer will personalize the recipe with their unique selection of ingredients, the consumer expects those initial characteristics to be met. If the color is too light, the appearance will be copper and better resemble an amber. Too dark, it may be closer to a porter or stout. Too hoppy, and it begins to drift into the category of India Brown Ale. While all of these are acceptable styles, if it's not what the brewer intended to brew, it's an indication of a problem with recipe formulation. Once the brewer has settled on a basic style, they must then begin to target specific goals. The very first things to consider are the size of the batch, the yeast or bacteria that will be used, and the desired original gravity or the alcohol content of the finished beer. Next would be approximate bitterness and color, malt and hop characteristics, and whether special ingredients like fruits and spices will be used. With these desired characteristics identified, the brewer may begin to select and source their ingredients. Number 2, determine malt and extract bill. Traditionally, ingredient selection begins with the fermentable portion of the recipe, which makes up the malt and extract bill. At this step, the brewer begins building the beer by determining both the character and quantity of the malts and other fermentables. Not only do these ingredients help determine the alcohol content of the beer, but they will also largely impact the color, clarity, flavor, aroma, mouthfeel, and head retention of the finished beer. Whether a brewer chooses to source their starch from malted barley, wheat, oats, rye, rice, or any other sugar that is irrelevant to the fact that there must be sugar present to make beer. Without it, there is nothing to ferment. And while barley and other grains are still the leading source of fermentables for most brewers, the increasing interest in gluten-free products does have some brewers looking for alternatives. Determining the proper base malt and ratio of specialty malts in the mash is largely influenced by the style, but can also vary based on availability and personal preference. Once the grains have been selected and their proportion of the mash has been calculated, the type of mash program is selected. From there, the quantities of each grain are determined by calculating backwards from the target gravity to the grain bill. Number 3, considering water and water treatment. As covered in another section of this module, the characteristics of the water, the concentration of its minerals, and the water treatment regimen all have an impact on the mash chemistry and finished beer. Additionally, the presence of chlorine, ammonia, or pollutants can produce off flavors and should be addressed prior to brewing. Another important consideration is the volume of water needed to achieve the desired batch size. With some water being absorbed by the grain, more being lost to process and in the mash tun and transfer piping, and more yet lost to evaporation during the boil, a brewer must have good working knowledge of water volumes to ensure that the volume of beer they intended is what actually ends up in the fermenting vessel. Number 4, determine the hop bill. At this step, the brewer must determine what levels of bitterness, flavor, and aroma they hope to achieve from the hop additions. Hops are an excellent ingredient for beer because the bitterness they add is used to offset the sweetness of the malt, creating a more well-balanced beer. While most brewers have a favorite hop, the use of different varietals can have a huge impact on the complexity of a recipe. There are currently over 90 varietals of hops available to brewers, each with its own unique set of characteristics. Pine resin, citrus, floral, tropical, and earthy are just a few of the flavors and aromas that a brewer can achieve by selecting the right hop for a recipe. Hop utilization and isomerization will be covered in another section, but every brewer must have at least a basic understanding of how each hop addition will affect the amount of bittering units in a recipe and whether that addition will have an impact on the bitterness, flavor, or aroma of the finished beer. Number 5, select yeast and fermentation plan. Yeast is considered by many brewers to have the greatest impact on the final flavor of a beer. Every yeast strain has its own profile with a unique set of flavors, esters, and aromas that it imparts on the finished beer. The yeast selection will also affect the alcohol content based on how well it completes fermentation or attenuates. The clarity is also largely determined by how well the yeast drops out of suspension after fermenting in a process known as flocculation. At the very basic level, a brewer must decide whether to use an ale, lager, or specialty yeast. This will then determine the amount of yeast to pitch, what temperatures to ferment at, and for how long. There is also a growing trend in using wild yeast like Brettanomyces and bacteria like Lactobacillus and Pediococcus to assist in fermentation. While once considered beer spoilers, the growing palate for sour beers has opened up an array of both old and new styles for brewers to explore. Number 6, ascertain finishing issues, including clarification and carbonation. There are many ways to clarify beers, including time, temperature, and mechanical filtration, as well as clarifying agents added in various stages of the process. Deciding what, if any, clarifying methods will be used should be determined prior to brewing. Similarly, there are several methods available for carbonating finished beer that must be considered before brewing. Naturally carbonating in tank, forced carbonating using a sintered carbonation stone, and bottle and cask conditioning are all options based on the brewer's preference and the equipment they have available. Another finishing issue that must be considered prior to brewing pertains to the use of specialty ingredients. With so many potential ingredients available from around the world, the possibilities are only limited by a brewer's imagination. Some example of specialty ingredients and processes include fruits and juices, vegetables, herbs and spices, coffees and teas, wood and wood barrel aging, sugars like lactose and molasses, and cocoa nibs. Many specialty ingredients can be added at different stages of the brewing process, giving each addition a different level of intensity and in some cases fermentability. Careful consideration must be taken when using specialty ingredients to ensure the brewer achieves their desired effect. Oftentimes a brewer may need to experiment a few times with these ingredients to determine when to add and how much to add to get it right. Testing and pilot brewing. The final stage of recipe formulation is testing the recipe by brewing it. Only then can a brewer truly determine the success or failure of the recipe. For some larger brewers, they may experiment with a much smaller batch that they can adjust as they choose before scaling the recipe up for larger production runs. But for the smaller brewers, testing often means brewing a full-size batch and hoping for the best. As a brewer becomes more experienced, it only makes sense that these experimental batches become less of a leap of faith and more of a controlled study. As you will learn in other sections, brewers face the challenge of working with ingredients that change from crop to crop and farm to farm. A brewer's ability to not only read a grain and hop report, but to be able to apply those changes to their existing recipes is an ongoing practice that further emphasizes the importance of good recipe formulation. In conclusion, recipe formulation is critical to the success of a great beer and in turn a great brewery. As the craft industry continues to evolve and become more competitive, it has never been more important for a brewery to have a solid portfolio of beers. A brewer's ability to create flavorful, well-executed brews time after time will not only provide the foundation for a new brewery to build its business, but it will also help an established brewery continue to grow and stay relevant.